The Partygate scandal has clearly strained voters' trust in Boris Johnson's government. But where does it leave British politics as a whole, which for some time has been hamstrung by low levels of public confidence in politicians? It's a big issue at the John Smith Centre, which exists to make the positive case for politics and public service. Well, its director is the former Scottish Labour leader Kezia Dugdale, who today chaired an event discussing why there is distrust in politics. She spoke to Scotland Tonight. We're waiting for the full Sue Gray report on the Met inquiry, but do you think the Court of Public Opinion has already, made up its mind about Boris Johnson?
Yes, they have, and there's plenty of evidence for that in the polls. So the first thing to look at is the Prime Minister's own approval ratings, which have fallen through the floor. Next, you can look at how the parties are faring in the context of how people might vote in a general election. And we've seen now for 2 months consistently Labour ahead of the Conservatives. That's really about how people might vote in a general election. It doesn't speak to a long-term trend about the damage that a story like this can do, or indeed the degree to which we trust our politicians. For that, we need to look a little bit further. And the most striking poll evidence that I've seen actually comes from Ipsos Mori, when they look at what issues matter most to people across the United Kingdom. Now, traditionally, we've always expected the economy to be the #1 issue in that poll. For the past 2 years, it's naturally been COVID. But the latest issues poll from Ipsos Mori shows us that trust and faith in politicians and governments is now the second biggest issue of concern to people across the country, pushing the economy further down that list. That shows us that this is getting greater attention than any scandals that might have preceded it. And it's also got that critical thing called cut-through. We know that at least 2/3 of the public across the United Kingdom have heard about Partygate. The only bigger story in town, in the eyes of what's really getting through to voters, is the cost of living issues that we're faced with, rising gas prices.
Levels of trust in politicians were already low before Partygate. Why do you think that was?
So they've been low since records began, and in a way that's a good thing, because we don't really want to have high or extortionate levels of trust in our politicians. The countries that have that tend to be dictatorships or other countries that we don't want to be like. That said, the levels of low trust are falling through the floor. They took a considerable dip after the last economic crash and the MP's expenses scandal back in 2008, and they got worse still in the context of Brexit. They're also increasingly unequal, and we've done our own work at the John Smith Centre looking at this, which shows that women, those in low incomes and young people are increasingly distrustful of politicians and institutions. So it's going through the floor, caused by past events like MP's expenses scandal and Brexit, but it's also increasingly unequal, with more and more people turning their backs on traditional forms of political participation, and I think that's what should really worry us.
You were chairing a session today about repairing trust and democracy. What do you think is the most important way to do that?
Well, the organisation More in Common, who've produced much of the research that we were discussing today, have come up with 9 recommendations of things that need to change. Unfortunately, none of them will make a big difference overnight. They all require a long-term commitment, and they require lots of people to act. But the single most important thing that this evidence shows us matters is that when people break the rules, they are punished for breaking the rules. Now, that's not just a rule that needs to apply in politics. It needs to happen with the police. It needs to happen in every walk of life. The evidence is there that people will increase their levels of trust if they see that there's a price to be paid for breaking the rules. So code of conducts, standards, rules being observed is a critical part. There's a lot more that we can do, though. First of all, and I would say this repeatedly, is that we've got to stop trashing people in public life. We need to do more to focus on the good in politics and the people that are doing good things and the issues which are rising to the top of the agenda. We need to make the positive case for politics, remind people that it is a noble vocation done by the vast majority of people driven by good values. That's really important as well. There's a bit of work for the media to do, and there's a bit of work to do around cutting down on fake news, misinformation, disinformation. This is what we call democratic safeguards, the types of things that make our democracy function well.
So when you say we should cut down on people trashing politicians, I mean, is it the media that you're talking about? I mean, who are you blaming for that?
Well, I'm not here to apportion blame, and I think it's really important that the media do the job that they're encouraged to do, which is about getting to the bottom of scandals and facts and sharing those developments with the nation. I just think there might need to be a few more spaces where we create the opportunity to talk about the good in politics, about the good work that's being done. Now, I appreciate that doesn't necessarily lead your programme, Rona, on a Thursday night, but it's important work if we care about the preservation of our democracy.
Okay,
just finding a little bit of time now and again to point to the good in politics.
What about the way politicians speak to each other?
Yep, you're absolutely right. That's another issue that's identified in the report by More in Common. It's something that the John Smith Centre often talks about. We need to learn how to disagree better as a country, as a citizenship, as a populace. That's much easier to say than it is to do. And I often worry that when we talk about this, we just say, oh, politicians just have to be nicer to each other. And that kind of sentiment lasts 24 hours before the world moves on. But we are more polarised than we were before. And that's caused by global forces like populism. We're becoming less tolerant as people, less respectful of opinions that are different from our own. And I think we all have a duty to try and address that and create the space for difference, tolerance and respect in how we talk to each other and how we debate the big issues of the day.
One of the suggestions being made by the think tank More in Common is for schools to be used to foster stronger democratic commitment amongst young people. I mean, is that what schools should be doing? I mean, what do you think they should be doing to foster that?
That definitely feels right to me, and I think anybody who was involved in the independence referendum campaign back in 2014 speaks fondly of the way in which that debate was done within a school environment, how 16 and 17-year-olds were encouraged to be a part of the big debates that the country was talking about. We often talk about citizenship education. Modern studies is a really key part of the Scottish curriculum, but I think there needs to be more done to make sure that young people see that they have power and agency. There's a lot of evidence to show that young people are turning away from traditional forms of participation, like voting, in favour of taking more direct action, whether that be through protests or signing petitions. It's possible to encourage both. Both are important parts of a functioning democracy. And a big part of what we do at the John Smith Centre is to try and encourage young people towards jobs and roles in public life, whether that be working with politicians, being politicians, working in the vibrant third sector that we have in Scotland, believing in that concept of public service, believing in making the world a better place, and their role and capacity and ability to do that is really key.
We've talked quite a lot about Westminster, but what about levels of trust at Holyrood?
So interestingly, one of the key findings in the More in Common report is calling for more devolution. Now, the John Smith Centre doesn't have a position on that, but the academic evidence is there to demonstrate that people are more likely to trust politicians and political institutions the closer they are to them. So you can presume from that the Scottish Parliament is trusted more than Westminster, but so then too are local authorities trusted more than the Scottish Parliament. And there's evidence to suggest that you're far more likely to trust your local councillor or your member of Parliament if you've actually met them. So that proximity to public life is really important.
All right, Kezia, Dugdale, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. After 2